Good evening. I hope that you had a wonderful dinner if you were here in person. For those joining us online, I want to extend a special word of welcome. I know that people are watching from Canada and Colorado and obviously all over Oklahoma. I have a tendency on something like that. I always remember a children's show in Ohio when I was growing up. It was out of Cincinnati. It was the Uncle Al show, which sounds kind of strange now, but there was Uncle Al and Wendy, and there was a portion of the show where Wendy would look in the camera and say all the kids that she saw. I see, Betty and Susie and Jackie and John. Well, guess what name is never called if the person calling the names, if her name's Wendy, I waited every week, Wendy. So for all the places that are watching tonight, know that, I know that you're watching, and we're so glad that you're joining us tonight. Dr. Long, Bob is in Colorado. I called out Colorado, Bob. And he is working on stewardship sermons that we are in the midst of our stewardship sermon series. And so I know that he wishes he could be here tonight. But the mountain air of Colorado won out, and so he's suffering for Jesus, and we'll see if I still have a job, or maybe my name will get called when he comes back. It is so good to join together online and in person, and let us join together in an attitude of prayer. Almighty God, it is so good to come into your presence, and it is good to come together. We pray that you would be with us. Open our hearts and minds to you, to your message, to your guiding presence. Help us to know more about you, to love you more deeply, and be willing to serve you more passionately. Help us to be better neighbors to one another, and help us in our own belief. Help us to know what the weightier issues are and to focus on those. Help us to love you and to love others. Through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. Tonight we want to look at one of the questions that we have been asked repeatedly, both as a very specific practical question and also as a real theoretical kind of a sense of kind of an exclamation. And that question is, when they hear all the issues going on and the back and forth and the fighting, we're asked, well, can't everybody just work together? And yes, we should be able to do that. And I want to walk through some areas where that has been tried over and over so that you all know what has been attempted and why we may seem a little skeptical about what may happen at General Conference 2024. It's not that we are negative people. It's looking at the pattern of action that has gone before. Remember last week, for those of you who are here, Dr. Long, Bob brought up the paradox. I just lost his name. So thank you, staff. Stockdale paradox. We talk about this all the time in staff. I'll probably hear about this and get a little ribbing. It is one of our principles, and in the book, Good to Great, Collins was writing about this paradox. And it was by Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was captured and was one of the longest prisoners of war, brutally beaten and tortured over years. And he would end up coming home, and just an incredible person. And he had an undying belief that he was going to come home and use that situation for good in his life. And so when, I believe it was Jim Collins who heard that, he asked him, okay, well, if you survived with that kind of attitude, who didn't survive? And remember what Bob said, well, the positive people, The optimists didn't survive. And that didn't make sense. You just said you had an undying belief that you were going to come home and use this for good in the world. And he said, don't confuse that. He said the optimists, and probably more like kind of the blind faith optimists is maybe a better description, they were the ones who got captured around Thanksgiving. And so they thought, okay, by Christmas, it's the birth of Christ. They'll have this feeling, they should let us go, we'll be home by Christmas. Well, Christmas came and Christmas went, and they were still captured. And they said, okay, by Easter, surely by Easter they're going to let us go because that's the resurrection of Christ. They'll set us free. Easter came and Easter went. And then 4th of July. Independence Day, of course. That's the day we'll all be set free. That day came and went, and finally it came back around to Thanksgiving and another Christmas, and they died, just out of this sense of loss and a loss of hope. He said that the paradox is looking at the most brutal facts of your present reality and yet having an undying faith that you will overcome. And in our situation, it's looking at the most brutal facts and understanding that God is still with us and God will lead us through. And so when we talk about some of these issues, it really is just looking at the most brutal facts and understanding that God will guide us. So I want to talk about some of the things that have been tried. I want to look back at General Conference 2012. And it was in Tampa, Florida, and there was kind of this overwhelming sense of change. One of the first things was a change, legislation to change the overall structure for the church, and that would end up being defeated by the Judicial Council, who ruled it unconstitutional. But one of the major moments was the decision to do away with guaranteed appointment. Now, guaranteed appointment is somewhat similar to tenure in the university kind of setting. For guaranteed appointment, it was brought about by well-intended people in the United Methodist Church in the late 60s to help women and people of color to not be rejected by a church. And so they would be encouraged to go into ministry because they would be guaranteed an appointment. It's hard to encourage women to go into ministry or people of color to go into ministry if they have the belief, and it was well-founded at that time, that no church would take them. And so this was developed, well-intended, and with great motives. But what has happened, what it means now, is that if anybody's ordained as an elder, then they are guaranteed an appointment. And so it's easier to kind of pass a United Methodist minister on to another appointment, to another one, if they're problematic, rather than get rid of them, because officially they're under guaranteed appointment, guaranteed salary. And that has caused some problems, as you can imagine. It works great if you only have great ministers. And for many years, I think that was probably the case, that almost everybody who came out were very similar in their theology and their practice of ministry. But over time, we went from very strong kind of authoritative bishops and people in reacting against kind of a strong authority kind of swung the other way. And I remember when I went before the Board of Ordained Ministry, it was held at Canyon Camp, which is a United Methodist Church campground here in Oklahoma. And so I wore my suit and heels because it was an interview. And I took it very seriously. This was my vocation. I thought it was my calling. And so I dressed what I thought was very appropriately, and because it was in a camp setting, the rest of the Board of Ordained Ministry, they were in sweatsuits, track suits, and which is okay, But the first question I kept getting asked every time I went before them was, what can we do for you? Now that is very, very nice. It is so nice. But it's what turns the Board of Ordained Ministry to a focus on our greatest goal is helping a pastor versus our greatest goal is ensuring the right pastors for local churches. And both of those can be wonderful things. But if you don't become adding a gateway in there, then sometimes not all the pastors who come through might be truly the right ones for churches. I'll just say it that way. But they're guaranteed an appointment. There have been times where the conference has had to create appointments because they couldn't find a church that would take certain pastors because of the issues with that pastor. And so at the General Conference 2012, guaranteed appointment came up for a vote, and it was set aside, or it was voted down. And so guaranteed appointment was done. That's a huge thing, huge. And so there was this sense of accomplishment, this feeling of, we did this. Oh my goodness, we did this. Well, on the last day of General Conference, someone brought it back up and wanted to revisit the vote. And you can do that if you vote to revisit the vote. And so they took a vote, and people didn't want to do it. That was voted down. And so it was going to be that they let the decision stand of the General Conference. Instead, since that was voted down, a person went and referred it to the Judicial Council. Now, that's become a really political move. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but sometimes it's also, I wish to throw it to the Judicial Council. And it's a really low bar on that kind of vote. It only takes a fifth of the delegates to move it on to the Judicial Council, and then it's kind of in their hands. It would subsequently be ruled unconstitutional. And so that was the decision to move it to the Judicial Council happened on the last day of General Conference 2012. And if you want to be in a group of people who felt like, okay, we're not all in agreement and we're still fighting about some of these issues, but we did something here. On the last day, right before everybody goes home, the closing kind of things, oh, we probably didn't. It just kind of sucks all the air out of the room. So that was 2012. One of the other things about guaranteed appointment that can make it an issue is even if everybody's wonderful, in a lot of conferences, the Board of Ordained Ministry operates independently from the bishop and cabinet. So they have the Board of Ordained Ministry has a responsibility to kind of vet all the candidates and make sure they're called and that they're effective. And if so, they pass them on and recommend them for ordination. But that is done in kind of a silo apart from whether or not there are any appointments for them. And so if you have a conference that actually has all their appointments filled, but you have a large ordination class of 10, and they're all sent forward for ordination, well, now you have to find 10 places for these people who, if they're ordained, guaranteed appointment. So that was one of the other issues about guaranteed appointment, which is still in effect. And sometimes I probably ought to be very thankful that I have guaranteed appointment when I make jokes. So that was on the last day of General Conference 2012. It showed the delegates all in that room that even when they all worked together, and I put that kind of loosely because together is probably not the correct word, but they did get a vote of something big passed. And so together they did this, but even that could be quickly undone. The other thing that happened that was important from General Conference 2012, it was pretty much the writing on the wall for those of the Progressive Party. Because through the 80s and 90s, the people who had, from the very beginning, wanted equal rights for people of all, like LGBTQ, anybody of that community, they wanted equal rights for that community. And they were, from the beginning, as part of this kind of social justice for this community, they started to see that our society here in the United States started becoming more accepting. And they started to see that through the 80s and through the 90s, things were beginning to change. And so I think in many ways, they started to see, oh my goodness, this will be changed in the United Methodist Church. The restrictive rules in our Book of Discipline are going to be changed. And that probably would have happened because there was changing of opinions throughout the country. But it didn't happen quick enough to override the votes that were coming out of the World Central Conferences, especially in Africa, where the church was just exploding. And so in 2012, that was really writing on the wall that their numbers had grown so much, and the groundswell in our country was never going to top it. And so I think it was kind of the nail in the coffin that not only could we not get something changed together as a conference, they wouldn't be able to overcome the conservative vote and get those restrictive rules changed. And so 2012, I think nobody left happy out of that. I think it was Bishop Bickerton who said that the General Conference of 2012 is like the old saying, when all is said and done, there was a lot more said than done. And that was probably the way a lot of people felt after that. And so what happens if you are committed to a what you believe to be your social justice commitment, and you see that this way, the way of kind of legislation and going through the ranks of the Methodist process, that's really been shut down to you? What do you do with that? You find other ways to live out and bring attention and live what you believe to be true. In 2013, Bishop Melvin Talbert announced that he was going to perform a same-sex wedding in Alabama. Now, at that time, same-sex wedding or same-sex marriages were not legal in that state. And so he announced this well ahead of time. Why? To draw attention to it. Bishop Talbert is a bishop who is committed to social justice issues. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable to talk about. Is it important? Is this an important issue? Absolutely. But what did it do to conservatives? So for the progressives, they saw their last means of bringing change shut down. And so what was left to them? Bishop Melvin Talbert announced, I'm going to do a same-sex wedding in Alabama, not the hotbed of progressive thought, at least at that time. I don't know if that's changed. The bishop of Alabama at that time begged him not to come do that because it would cause all sorts of problems. It wasn't, for her, it wasn't about the issue of same-sex wedding, but for him to really kind of throw it down, and the turmoil would be left to her to kind of clean up what to do with that and how to overcome that. But he went ahead and did it, and it caused lots of issues in the Methodist Church. For the progressives, again, what other choices do they have if they are committed to bringing change? For the conservatives, they're like, okay, the bishops, here you have a bishop throwing it down. It's clearly stated in the discipline, isn't anybody going to follow this? And not only that, this bishop came down to the Deep South, and so it wasn't that was the first same-sex wedding that had ever happened. There was this weird kind of equilibrium, that's probably not the right word. There's this weird, lots of same-sex weddings were going on in different parts of the country. But this one was really going to be, okay, this is where we're at, and this is what we're going to throw down. And so, of course, that caused lots of consternation. Charges were brought, and it was settled, it was discussed, but basically he remained in his position and continues on. So, aside from what you believe about same-sex weddings, he did have this tendency, I'm going to do this, and I'm broadcasting it well in advance because I want to create this tension. I want to create the argument. He is a man committed to social justice. So not everything is so clear. It gets fuzzy. You can have people make choices that you may agree with part of it, or you may agree with none of it or all of it. So for conservatives, they saw an increasing number of kind of these affronts to their own beliefs, and they became ever more organized and really were working with the African delegation for many general conferences. They became very good at working with the African delegates. They would meet with them before every general conference and provided them with lots of hospitality, and they would provide them with cell phones. Now, you can imagine if the conservatives are trying to give cell phones and gifts to the African delegates, there were allegations that they're bribing them. They're trying to buy their votes. Now, I can tell you, maybe there would be one or two that would vote differently, but there weren't votes being changed. The African delegates are very conservative. That's how they were going to vote. What was happening, right or wrong, and you may disagree with whether this is right or wrong, what was happening is that the African delegation was learning how to work the system. And so, yes, the conservative wing of the delegation was trying to be really nice to this large block of voters. It didn't prevent the progressive side from doing that. I don't know that they would have been able to buy their votes. If there was a chance of buying votes, the progressives could have done that, but I really don't think votes weren't being changed. And so they wouldn't have been able to pay that because the Africans are very strong in their convictions, and by and large, they're all very conservative. But of course, there's this back and forth of, one, you're trying to buy these votes, and the allegations would rise up. And on the other side of it, what does it say about the African delegation? That they can be bought, that it can take just a simple thing to change their convictions, and of course none of that wasn't accurate. So as the African delegation grew larger and larger, by the latest general conferences, they got more and more politically savvy, to the point that they were on lots of these committees initially, because of language barriers and not understanding the political system, because it is kind of its own beast. They were more quiet, but on recent general conferences, they grew more and more bold for their own desires. And so you do have this growing majority, like we talked about last week, growing a number of the African delegation, and from the African delegation, they represent giving of only about 1% to the overall general conference budget. But here's the dilemma. What happens if you have a large portion of the church that only gives 1% to the budget, end up controlling the budget. The flip side is, what happens if you have a large part of the church that isn't growing? They control the budget. And so I don't think it's crystal clear. The church is growing in Africa, but they only have a small percentage that's given to the General Conference budget. One of the things that really started happening at the most recent General Conferences is as the African delegation grew, they have the rule of one minimum delegate per annual conference. And so an annual conference is guaranteed. They have to have at least one clergy delegate and one lay delegate. You can't go below one. Well, actually, you can, because when you are voting on electronic devices, which they did, you have the ability to kind of mathematically assign the decimal to skew votes to whatever representation that conference should have. What happened, though, as, say, conferences on the West Coast or the East Coast, which are smaller than some of the central conferences, the Southern conferences, they got to the minimum of one clergy delegate per conference. And so, because of the rule, you can't take anything away from them, where did the votes start leaving? They started being taken away from, like, the Oklahoma Annual Conference. I remember when we used to have 11 clergy, and I think recently it was down to 7. So the voice of someone like the Oklahoma Annual Conference started to decrease, even though we're not on the lowest end of strength of conferences. We're larger and stronger than many conferences, but because of that one rule, the votes and the voice was taken away from groups like ours. And so that kind of skewed things a bit as well. So by 2016, a General Conference was, I'm not sure the word, it was dismal. It was depressing. It didn't feel like a spirit of Christian conferencing. The word conference for Wesley was not just a noun, it was probably much more about a verb. You conference together, kind of akin to fellowship. You gather together in conferences. You conference for the purpose of worship and prayer and inspiration and lifting each other up. And that didn't feel like the case in 2016 in Portland, Oregon. And every day there's a booklet of the proceedings called the Daily Christian Advocate. And they had these little call-out boxes in the newspaper, in this Daily Christian Advocate. Can you put the one that has the successory? Okay, see, there's this call-out, say, pride. And when I first saw it, I thought of the image on the right. You've probably seen these successories where they have posters, and this one says vision. A leader's job is to look into the future and to see the organization not as it is, but as it can become. I mean, and that would have been perfect for General Conference 2016. Instead, they had call-out boxes, and this is one of them on the left. It said pride. And so at first when I read, I'm like, oh yeah, pride, I'm proud to be a United Methodist. And it says, the blustering wind of pride in a people's hearts causes them to jostle against each other and so to split themselves one upon another. Oh, that was uplifting. Go to the next slide. These were all throughout the Daily Christian Advocate. Rashness. Rashness causes people suddenly to provoke others without considering what ill consequences might come of it. Contention. If you have any spirit, any zeal and courage, it is a pity it should be laid out in quarrels. Jealousy. Conflict and evil suspicion are relatives. And then again, pride. So you have this. Now, do I agree with these kind of definitions? Yes. Do I want them to be the inspirational boxes in a daily Christian Advocate? It's not inspiring. And the more that a person feels bad about themselves, I've never seen them act better. If you beat a person down, they don't tend to respond by, you know what, you are right. I'm just going to change, and I'm not going to show any pride, and I'm not going to have any contention or jealousy, and I'm not going to be rash. I didn't see people read these boxes and respond that way. It was depressing. So if you have a daily presentation that's full of these call-out boxes, then you have some of the bishop's remarks from bishops that were definitely more progressive, and I'm sure feeling the frustration of a lack of change for what they were committed to, really going more on the offensive. It wasn't uplifting, to say the least. You had, as we mentioned last week, Don House trying to bring forth a benchmark project that would have infused money into 1,000 churches for the sake of growing the church, because he was so concerned about the decline of the church. We talked about this last time. And people labeled what he was doing a coup against the church. He spent all of this time and energy trying to think of some way to save the Methodist Church, and it was, kind of an accusation that he was trying to steal the resources, and in the end, he was removed from his position on the General Conference Finance Special Committee. The General Conference Finance tried to reduce the budget. In the end, the African delegates requested $10 million, and the body approved that. And so it was added $10 million more dollars into that budget. And then one of the really, really, to me, sad things, among many other sad things, were the accusations against Bishop Bill McAlilly. Is that the pronunciation, McAlilly? I'm going to go with that. Pardon? Okay. So when you're doing, the bishops preside over the business sections, and some are better at parliamentary procedure than others. But in the midst of these kind of general conferences, things get very heated. The delegates aren't all parliamentarians by any means. And so they can step up to the mic and it be out of order. They bring up something that was 2 or 3 votes ago, and it becomes a hot mess really quickly. It can get very convoluted, and so you can vote, like I said, if you want to revisit a vote, you have to vote again. And so you do that 2 or 3 times down the road. I want to amend that, or I want to change, I want to ask a question, and it gets really tangled. And some bishops are great at parliamentary procedure, and some are not as skilled. But then also some are very businesslike in the lead chair, and some are more laid back. And I would say this bishop seemed to be, I don't know him personally, but he seemed to be kind of very genuinely kind, and he didn't approach it as a stern disciplinarian. And this was later in the conference, and so people were already frustrated, and there was lots of fighting. I want to read to you kind of what happened. This is from the Daily Christian Advocate, and he had just called for a revote because he was concerned, right or wrong, whether the delegates all understood the vote that had been taken, because it was that confusing. And so he called for this vote. He tried to explain it. And then a delegate stood up, and she was recognized, and said, "With all due respect, Bishop." Let me tell you, when anybody says that phrase, it's not going to be good. You do not have the authority to determine the order of precedence of points of order versus questions versus statements for or against. It was explained at the beginning of the General Conference, and that is in our rules, that the points of order and questions take precedence. And she continued on, and he said, I receive that. I will say again that what I see on the screen rises to the top is the point of order. And there was a little back and forth, and someone else questioned what was going on, and so the bishop responded, let me check with my friends behind me, and what he was meaning, I'm checking with other bishops to see what's going on and if I've messed something up, okay? The next person got up and said, point of order, bishop, with all due respect, you are telegraphing votes. We saw it in committee, and we're seeing it now with telling people how to vote with your fingers. And I would take issue with this at this moment. And I'm not sure if he understood that it was a serious point of order, and so the bishop kind of laughed and said, wow, okay, I'm not aware of that, but I'll certainly sit on my hands or something. And said, then kind of went on. And I believe that he has an at-rest tremor or something that, at least his hands were described as fidgety. It went on, and there was still confusion amongst the delegation and from the chair. And so the first lady who said the first, with all due respect, got up and said, Bishop, I have a parliamentary inquiry or a question, which is whether, and this is going to be a difficult question to hear. It's a difficult question to name, but it comes from my heart. And it appears to me that you have single-handedly undone everything begun this morning with the Council of Bishops by the way you have presided. And if there is a parliamentary inquiry to have you removed from the chair, I make it now. And at General Conference, there was some applause to what she said. And then the bishop responded, I receive your request. I'm not quite sure how to rule on that. And the speaker responded, you may step down. And he said, yes, I sure can. And there were shouts and things started, people on both sides expressing themselves. And then I think he conferred and he explained where they were in the process. And she said, again, my request, Bishop, with all due respect, quit saying that. If you're going to criticize somebody, quit saying that. Was not for a clarification as to where we were going, but a request that you remove yourself from the podium and have another moderate, fair bishop preside instead of you. So I feel like that gives you a sense of what it felt like at that general conference. I was there for that moment, not as a delegate, but just as a witness, and I never got the sense, I didn't get the sense that he was the most precise parliamentarian. He had a more easygoing spirit. I didn't feel like there was anything he was trying to do intentionally to mess things up. All the General Conference delegates were very good at messing things up on their own. You didn't need bishops. There are times that a bishop really makes their opinions known. I didn't see that, but regardless, there are better ways to handle kind of those moments when you feel like things aren't going well. How do you address them, and what's the spirit? If you read that, you wouldn't think that was coming from a Christian conference. And so that was the spirit of 2016. And as the arguments just kept going and going about the questions, issues over human sexuality, it came to this, it just was going to explode. And so that's when it was referred. Adam Hamilton was one who stepped up and asked, bishops, we need you to lead us. And so that's when it was given back. But as that was happening, as the bishops were trying to develop, okay, how do we get something to lead the entire General Conference forward, in the summer of 2016, you had jurisdictional elections. And jurisdictional elections are kind of those regional areas, and each of the jurisdiction areas elect their own bishops. In 2016, and they all kind of happen at the same time. There's a little bit of staggering, but mainly they all happen at the same time, although a lot of times on the coast, they finish early. They don't have as many bishops to elect quite frequently. And so it got to the point where it was just basically the South Central jurisdiction that was finishing up their elections and the Western jurisdiction. And they were electing, I believe, one bishop, and in the end, they elected a gay bishop, Karen Oliveto. And as they were, so the process is, so if you are electing one person, you vote and they tally the number, and there has to be a certain number that person has to receive. And so what you see is that with each vote, sometimes people hold out, but after a while, people start dropping out and people kind of group around the person they want. And they started to see that Karen was the lead candidate. And they began to have discussions about what it would mean for them to elect a gay bishop. What would be the fallout, the ramifications, the accusations, and so in this discussion, I think the discussions were seen as part of the attempt to get a gay person elected for the reason of putting a gay person in office. Whether or not it was done out of concern, we need to think about what could happen, or as part of, let's keep talking about this, and it gives a little extra weight to this candidate. I don't know you could ever decide that. People decide it based on what their beliefs are about the issue. In the end, she was elected, and we have friends in the conference. She serves the Rocky Mountain Conference, and we've heard nothing except that she's an exceptional bishop. So whatever you think about the issue of in regards to her sexuality, she's an exceptional bishop. But that was on the table, and the South Central jurisdiction was meeting at the same time, and so that issue was raised, and a complaint was made against her, the Western jurisdiction, and that went to the Judicial Council. So people are like, okay, this is going to be decided, because now the issue of whether or not you can be gay and serve the church, they've got it. And so when their ruling came out, it wasn't probably satisfactory to anybody. Because basically, in layman's terms, what they did was say, it was wrong, but we're going to send it back to the Western jurisdiction to decide what to do with it. Okay? So I don't know if they were saying, let's just split it and we'll call it wrong. You obviously can't be a gay bishop because we don't ordain gay people. And so they called it wrong on one hand. They sent it back for them to have any kind of decision about punishment or what to do. And so nobody was satisfied. And again, just the anger just built up. In the meantime, she continues, and she is a great bishop, But these kind of issues, when you're having both sides just shoot shots at the other, that's what these past years have been like. So, in the meantime, the bishops were getting together a commission on a way forward. Because remember, the General Conference 2016 had charged the bishops, lead us, show us what to do. You help us get past this argument. So they brought together all these people for a commission on the way forward. We needed a way forward. And they called a specially called General Conference for 2019. And the recommendation was going to be for the one church plan, which we talked about last week. Not all the committee members agreed with that, but the one church plan was going to be basically serve according to your ministerial context. okay? But the conservative arm rose up against that, and they brought the traditional plan. And so at the General Conference of 2019, and leading up to the General Conference of 2019, it was interesting because we kept hearing from the progressive arm of the United Methodist Church that they knew that they had the votes, that they were going to win with the one church plan. And as they became more and more confident of, we have the votes, we're going to do this, we've talked to enough people, they don't want any more arguing, we're going to get this through. As they became more and more confident, they became less and less gracious. And so the conservatives had talked about having a gracious exit as part of legislation, and more we were hearing people from the progressive side, let's not have the gracious exit. Even some centrists. We get to General Conference of 2019, and the voting determined the priority of what the delegates wanted to deal with. And so they had all of these plans to bring forward, and the delegates were ranking them. This is a high priority for us to vote on. This is a low priority. And the number one thing to deal with, do you know what it was? It wasn't the traditional plan, which you might have thought. It was the pension plan. Wes Path, which oversees the pensions of United Methodist pastors, wanted to bring forth legislation dealing with pensions. And that won out. And it's a little bit embarrassing to say that, because out of all the years of arguing, we're at a specially called General Conference. And this should be, deciding, this should be the issue. But it was voted to talk about our pensions first and get that out of the way. Maybe giving the benefit of the doubt, with all due respect, it may have been, they thought, well, this will be easily voted, we'll get it out of the way. The second most important thing to vote on was the traditional plan. And so what did that tell everybody who was there watching? It said the traditional plan is going to win. So all of the work, so the bishops were charged, lead us. You take charge, and so they did all this work. They called the specially called General Conference, and all of their work was undone in one vote. So they talked about the traditional plan, and they went back and forth, and ultimately that won. And what that did was, it didn't change the restrictive rules against people of the LGBTQ community in our Book of Discipline. In fact, it put mandatory punishments in the Book of Discipline. We've never had that, but now nobody has a choice. You have to go with these mandatory acts of discipline. So if you have all of those things that have been tried, you have a general conference that kind of votes together, and that was undone. You have individuals like Don House trying to bring forth legislation to help growth in the church, and that was undone, and he lost his position for it. You have the General Conference or the General Finance Committee saying this is unsustainable because of the decline, and that was kind of put aside. The bishops worked together to present a way forward, and that was stopped. How do you bring change to the system? Following the specially called General Conference of 2019, I went to a meeting in Kansas City, and basically it was everybody who wasn't far right. So everybody left of the right. And I was there, and I felt like the new right in that room, if that makes sense. I felt by that time, because of the growing divide, I felt that I wasn't conservative enough for some of my conservative pastor friends. And I felt like I wasn't progressive enough. with some of my progressive pastor friends. And in fact, out of that meeting, just a few months later, we had a sermon series called Enough. And it came out of that sense of, am I conservative enough? Am I progressive enough? And how we all wrestle with, are we old enough? Are we young enough? Are we tall enough? Are we whatever? And for God, we are enough, because it came out of that situation. I'm like, I'm not sure about this. And Adam Hamilton had called the meeting, and for the far left of this group of people, they were not at all appreciative of Adam Hamilton's leadership. They felt that, who are you to come this late to our party? We've been saying these things all this time, and now you show up and you want to bring leadership? The reality was that he admitted that he felt late to the party of this issue, and he wanted to do what he could to help out. He was actually very humble, but was not well received. And so they all talked about, what can we do? And some of the arguments around our table, we were all around different tables of pastors from all over the country. And so I was around this table. It was fun to get to know them and their backgrounds. But then they started coming up with ideas, and this went around the room, that we should break into the worship services of conservative Methodist churches and disrupt their worship. And I'm like, I'm at the wrong table. But then I was like, this was happening at all the tables. And so the very next morning was the last morning, and while we had been divided up during that week, they brought the delegations back together for the last morning. And so I got together with the Oklahoman group, and we were a wide spectrum of everybody left of the far right. And so there was a wide group of different pastors there, and I just was still, my head was spinning. And so I said, look, I want us to talk about things, but I'm telling you that what happened yesterday, we will never be down with disrupting other worship services from the people at St. Luke's. That is not who we are. We don't act that way. We can disagree, but we're going to show love, and we would never do that. And thank goodness, every single Oklahoma pastor was as appalled as I was. And I am like, yes, Oklahoma is so good. We do have a standard. That was helpful for me, that our wide range, we all were unified. We were never going to do that kind of stuff. But it also does just show the hurt and the pain and the frustration that people have had who have fought so long, and to come up against barrier versus barrier. So then the protocol was developed. We told you what almost a miraculous thing that was, to get this group of people from the far right to the far left, and centrists and people from all over the world. They came together and miraculously came up with this wonderful plan that could allow for this gracious separation. And then COVID happened, and we started seeing the possibility, the protocol kind of diminish. And Reverend Josh Attaway and Dr. Long and myself went back to Kansas City for one more of these meetings, and we were really shocked and hurt to hear almost this undermining of the protocol. And what we heard again was, now we have the votes. And almost word for word, and we don't need to make it easy on them to leave. So it's playing the same cycle again and again. In the meantime, through all of that, it tends to take people's eyes off of what really matters. And the decline has only sped up. And I want to bring up the number, see, the first graph, not the second one, of attendance. So, again, this is the attendance decline in the Oklahoma Conference. This is average worship attendance from 2009 to 2019. In the U.S., the Methodist Church in the U.S. from 2009 to 2019. In the same period, what has happened at St. Luke's? Now, this kind of decline is particularly harmful for the small church. We told you how our apportionments had gone up in the past 3 years so much, but it's equally as devastating to the small church. Can you go to that table? And you probably won't be able to read this. And what this is this is 12 churches in Oklahoma that have an average worship attendance of under 60. Some of these are part of a 2-point charge, but these are 12 individual churches that have an elder appointed to them. Because why? We still have guaranteed appointment. So, there are churches that are given more pastor than they can pay for. And so when you have a declining church and you've had loss of churches and churches are declining, elders are being appointed to smaller and smaller churches. So each one of these has an elder appointed. Some are 2-point charges, and some are full-time appointments to this particular church. So the first column is average worship attendance. All you need to know that all of those numbers are under 60. The second column is the number of giving households. And so there's a range of numbers because you can have either higher number of households that give if people aren't able to make it in physically, or if you have a church with a lot of children, you may have lower number of households. But the third column that has the dark black line around it is the cost of pastoral support. And I'm going to read you some of these numbers. So the first church is a church that has 49 in average attendance. They have 32 households that give to their budget, and the pastoral support number is $63,543 for 32 households. Pastoral support is just the cost of a pastor. Now, one little asterisk, if you have too much pastor or not the right pastor, this is a burden. But if you have really good pastors, you can feel good about paying for them. I feel like we have great pastors at St. Luke's, and pastors can make a difference. But we don't have pastors, we're not staffed at St. Luke's for pastors for every 49 people in average attendance. So they're given their own elder. There's pastoral support of $63,000. If you go a couple more columns to the right, their annual conference and district apportionments are over $6,000. And so if you were to divide that per attendee or per household, it's a range of either $1,400 to about $2,200 per either of those parameters. So either $2,200 per household or $1,400 per individual. Not surprisingly, a lot of these small churches are in very rural areas where the average salary is very low. So this is the kind of, and it goes, you can go all through this. I know you probably can't see all the numbers, but this is what's happening to these small churches because of the things that we haven't kept our eye on, the way that we've done ministry. Can you go back to the first graph? And I say this about St. Luke's, not to brag on St. Luke's, although all of you are wonderful people, but to say what God is doing. I really am so excited about the way we try to keep our focus on the most important things, the weightier things of Scripture, of sharing God's love, of loving God and loving others. And this is what I believe is the reason for this kind of growth. And this is what happened during the pandemic. So, our worship attendance increased over 190% from 2009 to year to date this year. When you have that kind of almost straight up growth during a pandemic, you know God is in that. Despite these things that are very harsh realities and they're not super uplifting, God is in control. God is doing great things at St. Luke's. We are hearing individual stories and collective stories every single Sunday about people who are coming for the first time or coming back to church or joining online. God is doing amazing things, and we do have an amazing congregation. You all are loving. Nobody ever thinks that they all agree, but you know that we all agree about loving God and loving one another. That's the reason for this kind of growth, especially during a pandemic. Things are going to work out. We're going to keep our eye on the weightier things that matter. We want to be there and help and provide assistance to smaller churches and those that need help, but primarily we're going to continue to be St. Luke's no matter what, and God is going to be with us. What questions? I know it's on the dot. So I do have one question. If you have questions, you can pass them in. I have a question here. What happens if a church votes to disaffiliate, but the minister wants to remain United Methodist? Or if the church, there's a disagreement there. And so I have a friend who leads a church that the church will want to disaffiliate, thank you. And although they haven't taken this vote, they want to disaffiliate and they're ready to join the GMC, the Global Methodist Church. And that is not his theology. Oh, thank you. And so what he is doing, and I have such respect for him, he is leading the church as that particular church needs to be led, according to the context. It's not his theology, but he is there to follow kind of the way they do ministry and help them be the church they need to be. And so he will have to find or make a decision at some point. Does he continue with the church and kind of continue on for a while, leave later, or stay with them, or leave before? That would be the minister's choice about what they need to do. If the minister wants to disaffiliate, then I'm not sure of the appointment process in the GMC, but a minister can turn in their credentials to the United Methodist Church and approach the GMC and request their orders be recognized. But I'm not sure about what would happen with the appointment process. What happens to a minister's retirement if they disassociate with the church they serve? It would depend on what they do next. If they are part of a Methodist denomination that works with Westpath, their pension plan can kind of basically be kept intact and they continue to work there. If not, they'll probably have to make some arrangements in that regard. Define elder in the United Methodist Church and clarify guaranteed appointment. An elder, so the two orders are elder and deacon. And I like to say, or I describe it as the elders are the generalists and the deacons are the specialists. And so the elders kind of have the overall ministry of the church. They'll be the senior pastors, most typically, and preside over kind of the administration and the order and the sacraments of the church. Deacons kind of hone in. They'll be the specialists. If you go to see a doctor that's a specialist, they usually don't see you for the other things, just that one thing. And so a deacon kind of hones in on that. And Reverend Phil Greenwald was ordained as a deacon because of his business degree. And yet an incredible minister, he was honed in on that specialty. So that's the difference between an elder and a deacon. Another difference is for elders, in the United Methodist Church, you're appointed. You're sent to a church. You're under appointment. And guaranteed appointment was originally to protect the rights of minorities to be able to have an appointment. If they went through all of the work and all the expense of seminary and all the work of that, they would be guaranteed some place to serve. And now it's kind of like tenure. If you have guaranteed appointment, while you have it, you're guaranteed a place to work and receive salary and those things. Is the 190% attendance increase in person or a combination of in-person and online? Yes, that is a combination of in-person and online. And one of the neat things is that when we saw at the beginning of COVID and the pandemic, when we only had online, initially we had, I think our first Easter, when we first shut down, we had over 12,000 on Easter Sunday online. And that was because it was so new into the shutdown, and a lot of churches didn't have their online ministries up and running. And so we knew that we got a lot, and so our online decreased over time. And when we opened back up, we were kind of waiting, okay, what's it going to do to online? And so initially we had a very small percentage, and it kept growing, of in-person, to where we are getting close to some of our pre-COVID numbers, and yet our online presence still is very high and continues to grow. And so we're not completely back to pre-COVID numbers in person, but we are getting closer and closer, and that's feeling really good. And there have been some Sundays that, especially during Broadway, that really brought people out. And so it is a combination, but I would say that it's one that it feels very good because we are so pleased with our in-person numbers and the commitment of our online community. What is the possibility of St. Luke's joining other large Methodist churches like Church of the Servant, McFarland, Boston Avenue, and joining to form a new Methodist conference? Oh, I read this. I'm sorry, because there was instructions that this was the first page, and then I was to turn it over. But I'm a rebel, and so I did it wrong. I would say the probability rests in the decisions of the leaders of St. Luke's. We are very concerned about what can transpire at General Conference 2024. That if we want to pursue the ability to think and let think and not be forced to, everybody has to believe this or everybody has to believe that, we're concerned if that's ever going to be the case. And we're very concerned if it's not changed and we can still maintain this harmony of having people that disagree with this and people who do, and yet we can all agree that the most important thing is to love God and love others. We see that as kind of slipping away, and that there's the added possibility that it's going to become so punitive. The changes that happen at 2024 will make it so outrageous that we wouldn't be able to afford to leave. As the apportionments grow up, we're concerned that we are not able to afford to stay. And so it's not the greatest position to be in. If you can't afford to leave and you can't afford to stay, that's a quandary. But it will be left up to the leadership. It would require a church vote. And so if it came to that, you would all be involved. We want you to know all of the issues, but we do have a concern about just relying on the General Conference of 2024. Not seeing anybody lash out at that one yet. So, didn't Jesus break the law when it hurt people? Food rules, healing on the Sabbath, etc. If the issue is law versus people's needs, the Gospels say Jesus broke the law. Why not today? I don't know that was a question. It was a statement. And I would say that in the Methodist Church, we have changed our own document in the Book of Discipline from early in the 19th century, or early in the 1900s. It was forbidden. The only reason a person could get divorced was because of marital infidelity. And so if I had a person come to me that was being abused, but their spouse wasn't being unfaithful, what was I supposed to say to them? And the ruling was that you couldn't remarry somebody who got divorced and it wasn't for adultery. We've changed that. I think that was a good change. I think that was a very healthy change. I've counseled people who were in abusive situations and shared with them that they needed to get out. I've given my phone number to women that I thought were being abused, and I shared with them they could call me day or night. And I don't for a single minute think that I was going against the Word of God. So I will let this comment kind of stand. I do think that sometimes there's a great passage of the scribes and Pharisees who would focus on the tithes of mint and cumin that they would give and not the weightier issues of the law. And I do think it speaks to that. We're never going to agree on every single thing. Reverend Keith King and I, and additionally my husband, will have this argument at home about if you have beans in chili or not. Of course you do. If you leave them out, they're just a sauce. So we're not going to agree on everything, and I know that's a very lighthearted, it's not a comparison to some of the painful issues we're discussing, but we're never going to agree on everything. But we can love alike, we can serve alike. When I came to St. Luke's, when my father was killed in the bombing, nobody asked me about my political party or about my sexuality. The people of St. Luke's ministered to my family before you ever knew me. That's who we are. We're going to have differences. I mean, how boring would it be if we all believed the same thing? It would be impossible. But we can agree on the bigger issues of life. We can debate the smaller ones. That can be fun, except if it gets hurtful, but that's not who we are either. We're not hurtful people. We are people that know about loving God and loving others. And God is going to continue to do great things, and we're going to continue to be St. Luke's. Dr. Long will be back this Sunday, and we'll be here next Wednesday as well. So I hope you have a wonderful evening and safe travels home.